Hi everybody, my name is Jeff Strauss. This is part 2 of my 3-part series on teams. In part 1, available on my website jeffstrauss.net, we discussed the makeup of a team, how to build and assess a team, and we discussed in depth the 5 stages of a team life cycle. In this part 2, we're going to be discussing why teams don't work, and we're going to dive very deeply into why teams do work. So if you're a member of a team, or if you lead or manage a team, and you want to know what characteristics make up high-performance teams, how to improve the performance of your teams, this is the part of the series for you. We're going to dive very deeply into decades of research about the key components that make teams work effectively together and create high-performance teams. I hope you enjoyed this part of the series. Let's begin. Let's talk about why teams don't work. So now that we're able to recognize the stages of a team's life cycle from part 1 of this series, let's talk about anti-patterns in team design and leadership. We'll discuss why teams sometimes don't work, and as you progress through this part of the series, you'll learn how to correct or avoid some of the pitfalls that cause teams to underperform or fail. So research consistently shows that teams underperform because problems with coordination and motivation typically chip away at the benefits of collaboration. Even if you have a strong and cohesive team, it's often in competition with other teams, and that dynamic can get in the way of real progress. For example, regional sales teams are in competition with one another, but even in organizations without this structure, teams compete for resources like headcount, budget, project managers, and so on. These issues can create inefficiency or downright problems for a team, which can impact morale. Poor coordination and motivation can also lead to internal and external conflict on the team as emotions run high and morale runs low. Communication breakdowns become more frequent, as do bad communication habits. Conflict is listed as one of the 5 dysfunctions of a team in Patrick Lencioni's classic book of the same name. It also must be understood by everybody on the team and by the team leadership who is on a team, why they are on the team, and what their mission is. Putting together a team can involve some difficult decisions about membership because not everybody who wants to be on the team should be included, and sometimes those who are on the team should be forced off. Teams also need a clear sense of purpose, and it's the leader's responsibility to ensure that everybody understands what that is. Without a clear mission, members are likely to pursue their own. Unbounded and directionless teams are also the cause of some of the other dysfunctions of a team, according to Lencioni. These include an absence of trust in team leadership or other team members, which can lead to fear of healthy conflict, but over-indexing on unhealthy conflict, avoidance of accountability because nobody knows who is supposed to do what or what the shared objective of the team is, which can lead to lack of commitment toward the team, the mission, or leadership. There are other reasons why teams sometimes don't work. Research confirms that new teams are less performant than teams whose life cycles are further developed. Recall that in stage 1 of the team life cycle that we discussed in the last part of this series, the forming stage, accomplishments of the team tend to be fewer than at other stages. A NASA study found that fatigued crews who had a history of working together made about half as many errors as crews composed of rested pilots who had not flown together before. For more information on NASA's fascinating studies on fatigue, which I researched for this presentation, check out NASA's Fatigue Countermeasures Lab. The link is in the description of this video. The launch of a team is also critical. The ability to convey a vision and mission for the team and put the right people in the right positions on the team can be the guarantor of success. And if these things are not accomplished, it can spell disaster for the team. As a team leader, and as a leader in general, you shouldn't aim to lead your team, your new team, in the style of others. I once had a boss Personal anecdote, I once had a boss who told me he wanted to do things the Netflix way, but he had never set foot inside Netflix in any capacity. Ironically, my next job was in leadership at Netflix, and I discovered that my former boss didn't actually know what he meant when he said that. My point being, don't lead in the style of someone else. You're not someone else. You're you, and you have different skills, traits, talents, and abilities than other people. So lead to those. Be open to feedback and develop your leadership style. Teams also need organizational structures in place to support team development. Most companies have systems in place to identify the skills of a particular job and measure individual employees against those skills. The problem is that this is all about the individual. A single-minded focus on the individual employee is one of the main reasons that teams may underperform. Research out of Harvard found that coaching individual team members did not improve the performance of the team that those individuals were on. For a team to improve through support and coaching, it must focus on group processes rather than individual processes. Team leaders need to know how to run a kickoff meeting so members become oriented to and engaged with their tasks, and how to lead reviews at different phases of work so the team can discuss what's working and what isn't, which can help members make better use of their knowledge and experience the next time around. A common misconception is that if one head is good, two heads are better, therefore a team can get things done better than an individual. But this may not actually always be the case. Sometimes an individual may be more appropriate to accomplish a task or project than a team, and sometimes the reverse. Also, in the first part of this series, in part 1, we discussed the difference between a team and a working group, and sometimes it's more appropriate for a working group to get together to accomplish something rather than a team being formed. So it's important for leaders to understand where team performance could have the greatest impact. If performance in places within the organization where cost and value of the company's products or services are most directly determined, and these places are called critical delivery points, depends on combining multiple skills, perspectives, and judgments in real time, then creating a team is a smart move. But there are cases where it's not. There are many cases where collaboration could be more hindrance than help. In one example researchers published, being a team player was so strongly valued that individuals self-censored their contributions for fear of disrupting team harmony. The challenge for a leader is to find a balance between individual autonomy and collective action. And teamwork, quote, teamwork, represents a set of values that encourage listening and responding constructively to views expressed by others, giving others the benefit of the doubt, and recognizing the achievements of others. But these teamwork values by themselves are not exclusive to teams, nor are they enough to ensure team performance. Groups established primarily for the sake of becoming a team, or for outcomes like communication or organizational effectiveness, rarely become effective teams because these outcomes don't get translated into specific measurable goals. There are a lot of opinions about team size, but the reality is that depending on the type of organization, teams can be as small as 2 people to as large as hundreds of people. And technology helps companies extend participation to ever-growing numbers of people in ever-growing numbers of locations. Research indicates that as a team grows beyond 20 people and technology is introduced to bridge geographic, cultural, and language gaps, and there's a lot of diversity on the team, and a team is specialized towards a specific function, so those 3 things being true, a team size increases beyond 20, technology is introduced to bridge gaps, there's a lot of diversity, and a team is specialized towards a specific task. I guess that's 4. Complexity of the team increases. Those are the markers for increased complexity. And members of complex teams are less likely to share knowledge freely, to learn from one another, to shift workloads flexibly, to break up unexpected bottlenecks, and to share resources. In other words, the more complex a team becomes, the less effective it is in collaborating. Larger or complex teams are less likely to say that they sink or swim together, want one another to succeed, or view their goals as compatible. So collaboration is also affected by in-groups and out-groups. Research has shown that team members collaborate more easily and naturally if they perceive themselves as being alike in some way. Not necessarily just in nationality, gender, racial identity, or other common in-group, out-group markers, but even from within the same business unit or part of the organization. Collaboration tends to decrease in complex teams when team members are working with people they know only superficially or have never before met, like colleagues from outside their division or even outside the company. And recall how earlier we discussed the NASA pilot study, where fatigued pilots who knew each other, familiar with each other in some way, performed better than fresh pilots who didn't know one another. Research has also found that the greater the proportion of experts on a team, the more likely for conversations to disintegrate into non-productive conflict or stalemate. Obviously, this is not true in every case, and obviously, you should not eschew having experts on your team. But something to be aware of is that the more experts there are on the team, the more likely those experts are to lean into their own expert opinions and potentially cause conflict or stalemate. And more than being unclear, withholding, opaque, or other poor communication practices, poor communication also includes the inability to distinguish when direct or indirect communication is called for. Some team members use direct, explicit communication, while others are more indirect, for example, by asking a question rather than the more direct style of pointing out a problem. Relationships and team cohesion can suffer when team members see such differences as violations of their expected communication norms. And this is especially true on multicultural teams where communication styles can differ based on the cultural backgrounds of team members, making it even more important to establish communication norms in the early stages of a team life cycle, which we discussed in the first part of this series. So team members from hierarchical cultures may also expect to be treated differently according to their status in the organization, whereas members from more egalitarian cultures do not. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later on. While this is not true, obviously, in every case, failure to honor or recognize these differences and expectations can cause humiliation, loss of stature, and loss of credibility. And finally, I'll speak at length about norms in upcoming sections of this series, but in short, team members may have wildly differing expectations of how things should be done on a team, and without clear norms or rituals that can be used to guide the team vis-a-vis the team's values, operating procedures, and other processes. We'll talk about team processes. Team members can grow frustrated with a lack of structure and what can be perceived as an ad hoc or inconsistent nature of leadership of the team. Now, we spoke at length about why teams don't work, and we are going to now talk about why teams work and address all of the failings that we just discussed in the previous section. Let's discuss why teams work. So we're going to start with a few axioms and dive very deep into the art and science of team performance. To begin, in his book Leading Teams, Harvard professor J. Richard Hackman sets out 4 basic conditions that leaders must fulfill to create and maintain effective teams. First, teams must be real. People have to know who is on the team and who isn't, and it's the leader's job to make that clear. And I know from personal experience, and I'm certain that many of my listeners and many of you watching know from personal experience as well, that you have all been on teams. I have been on teams where throughout the course of a project or the life cycle of the team that we're on, sometimes we don't know who is on a team. We have, voices from the peanut gallery coming in. We have other people moving in and out of the group. It's very difficult to discern sometimes. That is a big indicator that a team is improperly built. So teams must be real. People have to know who is on the team and who isn't. And again, it is the leader's job to make that clear. Second, teams need a compelling direction. Members need to know and agree on what they're supposed to be doing together. If a leader doesn't articulate a clear direction, there is a risk that different members will pursue different agendas. The best teams invest a tremendous amount of time and effort exploring, shaping, and agreeing on a purpose that belongs to them both collectively and individually. Third, teams need a supportive organization and enabling structures. The organizational context, which includes the reward system, the human resource system, and the information system, must facilitate teamwork. Enabling structures like well-designed tasks, the right number and mix of members, or clear and enforced norms of conduct will be successful. Teams must also know how to communicate and facilitate team activities. And this is a different communication style than one-on-one communications. Fourth, teams need expert coaching. Individual performance is important, but teams need coaching as a group in team processes, especially early and late in the team lifecycle. The best teams also translate their common purpose into specific performance goals directly related to the team's overall purpose. That is a very, very important characteristic. I'll say it one more time. The best teams translate their common purpose into specific performance goals directly related to their overall purpose. Coaching can help transform broad directives into specific and measurable outcomes that can facilitate the translation of the common purpose into specific goals. So one thing you may notice about these 4 items here is that collaboration is not on it. Shouldn't it be? Collaboration is a key driver of team performance. Well, as we move through the Why Teams Work section, you'll see that collaboration is an abstract concept, and we'll be diving deep into the factors, qualities, and characteristics that underlie collaboration to change it from abstraction into action. Let's begin by talking about communication. So as we now know, communication evolves during different stages of the team life cycle, if you recall the stages of that life cycle from the part 1 of my series. Now, a little over a decade ago, research done at MIT's Human Dynamics Lab set out to discover why some teams consistently deliver high performance while other seemingly identical teams struggle. Over several weeks of collecting data on social behavior, the data indicated with remarkable consistency that the most important predictor of a team's success was its communication patterns. Those patterns were as significant as all other factors that were measured, including intelligence, personality, skill, and talent combined. The data was so strong that researchers could predict which teams would outperform others simply by looking at the data on their communications without even meeting members of the team. 3 communication dynamics affected performance: energy, engagement, and exploration, and we'll cover these in much more detail. The data also establish another interesting fact. Individual reasoning and talent contribute far less to team success than you might expect. Once again, individual reasoning and talent contribute far less to team success. The best way to build a great team is not necessarily to select individuals for their smarts or accomplishments, but to learn how they communicate and to shape and guide the team so that it follows successful communication patterns. This fact is the main takeaway and subject of my personal anecdote in my recent Leader to Leader video on the book Endurance, which is linked in the description of this video and can be found on my website, jeffstrauss.net, and on my YouTube channel. If you're interested in how this fact manifests in the real world, check that video out. Now, let's discuss some of these communication dynamics in depth. So the data indicate that successful teams share several defining characteristics with little variation. Everyone on the team talks and listens in roughly equal measure, keeping contributions short and sweet. In a typical high-performing team, members are listening or speaking to the whole group only about half the time, and when addressing the whole group, each member speaks for only his or her fair share of time, using brief statements that are to the point. The other half of the time, members are engaging in brief one-on-one conversations. When in person, members face one another and their conversations and gestures are energetic. So on my LinkedIn, I wrote a post on a fascinating study about how to make video conferencing communications more effective. You can find the link in the description of this presentation. In short, If you're remote, you can optimize your video setup by making sure your camera faces you head on rather than from overhead or at an angle, and it captures enough of your body in the frame to show gesticulations. This little circle that I'm in right now is a very bad example of that because I actually tend to gesticulate quite a bit. I speak with my hands a lot, and you might see my fingers sort of like, encroach upon the circle here as I'm gesticulating, but I do gesture quite a bit. Team members connect directly with one another, not just the team leader. If you're a team lead, encourage your team to create spaces, either physically or virtually, that don't include you, because members carry on back channel or side conversations within the team, and these are very healthy. Also, social time turns out to be deeply critical to team performance. And now members periodically break, go exploring outside the team, and bring information back. As a leader, empower your team to execute with the autonomy and authority to go exploring, go outside the team, bring information, and share it back with the team. Now recall that 3 aspects of communication affect team performance: energy, engagement, and exploration. Let's talk about energy. Energy is measured by the number and nature of exchanges among team members. A single exchange is defined as a comment and acknowledgement, like a yes or a head nod. Normal conversations are made up of many of these exchanges, and in a team setting, more than one exchange may be happening simultaneously. Consider the difference between a high energy and a low energy meeting. What might these meetings look like? An example of a low energy meeting could be updates on upcoming events, rule changes, and administrative details. Not a lot of conversations, usually unidirectional from the giver to the receiver without much interaction. Now, conversely, an example of a high energy meeting could be the announcement of a new discovery or breakthrough, generating excitement and a high number of exchanges. In other words, a lot of talking. Now, face-to-face is the most valuable form of communication, but video conferencing is second and is one that we're increasingly familiar and comfortable with in a post-COVID remote or hybrid workforce. There is a caveat though. Video conferencing gets less effective as more people participate. There is some data that suggests an ideal team size is less than 15 people, and a team on the cusp of being too big is between 12 and 15. Some data indicate that an ideal team size is 10 or less. We discussed previously that it really depends on the type of organization and the structure of that organization. But in general, we see data that indicate between 7 and 10 people is the ideal size for most teams. Some key indicators based on what we know about teams include how much individual attention you're able to provide your team members, for example, in one-on-ones, the volume of team-related tasks you're able to complete, which can scale up with team size, and how well you're able to facilitate communication and team building at certain team sizes. If these things begin to become untenable, it's time to consider creating multiple teams, each with a lead that you directly manage, rather than managing each individual on a team that's far too big. Now, the next dynamic of team communication is engagement. Engagement reflects the distribution of energy among team members. So recall that energy, for our purposes, is a technical term, and it's measured by the number and nature of exchanges. So engagement is a function of the average amount of energy between two individual team members, A and B and C, A and C, and so forth. Now, if all members of a team have relatively equal and reasonably high energy with all other members, engagement is extremely strong. Teams that have clusters of members who engage in high energy communication while other members do not, don't perform as well. Partially engaged teams tend to make worse decisions than fully engaged teams, and this effect is amplified in teams that are geographically dispersed and who have to meet via VC. Now, a key leadership lesson is maintaining high engagement. This can be done a number of ways, and you can get started with practical steps and much more information on employee engagement from an article on my Substack titled Maximizing Performance Through Employee Engagement, which is linked in the description of this video and is available on my website, jeffstrauss.net, in the writing section. Finally, keep in mind that engagement is an internal activity, meaning that the more energy people devote to their own team, the less of it they'll have to devote outside of it, which we'll discuss momentarily. Energy is a finite resource, so it should be put to the best possible use. Now, the third dynamic of team communication is exploration. Exploration involves communication that members engage in outside of their team. It's essentially the energy between a team and the other team it interacts with. The research indicates that higher performing teams seek more outside connections. The research also suggests that creative teams, like those responsible for product innovation, marketing, and so on, perform best when they're strong explorers, because these teams generally need fresh perspectives. The teams that MIT studied were suboptimal in this respect. They sought outside perspectives repeatedly from the same sources and only at certain times. For example, when building a business case or doing an after-action report. The best performing and most creative teams in the MIT studies sought fresh perspectives constantly from all other groups in the organization. Now recall that energy is a finite resource. The more it's devoted to one area, the less it can be devoted to others. Exploration is an external activity, unlike engagement, which is internal, but teams must do both, and successful teams oscillate between exploration for discovery and engagement for integration of the ideas gathered from outside sources. Now, finally, it's important to recognize how your team is communicating with each other, especially if you're leading a multicultural team. Failure to recognize the differences between direct and indirect communication and the cultural use of each of these styles can seriously damage relationships and can create barriers to effective teamwork by reducing information sharing. So recall that direct communication is more transparent and straightforward, whereas indirect communication is more nuanced and context dependent. The example I gave at the beginning of this part of the series on direct versus indirect communication were making statements compared to, for example, asking questions. Now, different situations and cultural contexts may warrant different communication styles, and effective communicators often know when to use each style appropriately. So let's discuss some of the key attributes of both forms of communication. In a direct style of communication, meaning is conveyed explicitly, and the speaker says exactly what they mean with no sugarcoating, whereas in an indirect style, meaning is conveyed implicitly and the speaker hints or suggests what they mean, allowing the listener to infer a message. Direct communicators are clear and concise, leaving little room for ambiguity or misunderstanding, whereas indirect communicators may be vague and ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation of the message. A direct communication style is more prevalent in individualistic cultures like the US and many Western European countries. An indirect communication style is more prevalent in collectivist cultures like many Asian, African, or Middle Eastern countries. In a direct style, the message is primarily conveyed through words and context is less important. But in an indirect style, nonverbal cues, contexts, and the relationship between the communicators are often as important as the words themselves. Direct communicators are more likely to address issues or conflicts openly and head-on, whereas indirect communicators tend to avoid confrontation and prefer to address issues subtly, sometimes not at all. That characteristic, not addressing issues at all, is not the realm only of indirect communicators. I have a lengthy presentation on my YouTube channel, on my website, jeffstrauss.net, about giving effective feedback and how to build the resilience and train the feedback muscle so that you don't avoid confrontation and you can address issues head on, because that particular issue afflicts many people. Now, direct communicators aim to resolve issues quickly and efficiently, valuing transparency and openness, whereas indirect communicators aim to maintain harmony and avoid offending others, valuing relationships and group harmony. A direct communication style tends to provide straightforward, candid feedback or criticism. An indirect communication style may convey feedback or criticism more gently, using hints, suggestions, or softer language. And it's important to understand that one communication style isn't necessarily better than the other, but a skilled communicator will know when to leverage the correct styles or a mixture of styles for the best outcome, because there are consequences if one style is used indelicately. I should also note that this table is not a definitive table. It doesn't mean that if you do one thing, you're always an indirect communicator versus a direct communicator. These are generalities. So some of these consequences of using a style indelicately may include direct communicators that are perceived as rude, blunt, or aggressive in cultures that value indirectness, but it can lead to quick resolution of problems and clarity of understanding. On the converse side, the other side of that coin, indirect communicators may be perceived as evasive or unclear in cultures that value directness, but it can preserve harmony and be more respectful and polite in certain contexts. So understanding whether a culture values direct or indirect communication can be crucial to avoid misunderstandings and foster positive relationships. Awareness of different communication styles can help in resolving conflicts and understanding each other better, especially in multicultural or multilingual settings. And as we talked a little bit earlier in this part of the series, setting norms and rituals for the team, but particularly norms, are very, very important. And some of those norms can include communication styles and behaviors that are valued on the team. So you don't necessarily have to tiptoe through these direct and indirect communication styles. When do I use each? What's the makeup and mixture of the cultures and interpersonal styles on my team? It's important to be aware of those things, and as a team lead, it's necessary for you to know the different communication styles of people on the team, and there are a lot of ways to actually determine what those are. One of my favorites is just asking people directly, how do you prefer to be communicated to and with? But again, it is important to be able to oscillate between different communication styles to convey a message most effectively. Okay, now before we move on from our comprehensive discussion of communication, we should note one feature of multicultural teams that may contribute to breakdowns in communication: accents and fluency of language. So although the language of international business is English, as of today, misunderstandings or deep frustration may occur because of non-native speakers' accents, lack of fluency, or problems with translation or usage, and these may influence perceptions of status or competence. Non-native speakers may become less motivated to contribute or anxious about their performance evaluations and future career prospects. This impacts more than just the individuals and teams. The company as a whole pays a greater price because its investment in a diverse, multicultural team is failing to pay off. And remember, when someone is a non-native speaker to us, we are the non-native speakers to them. So they may feel particularly disadvantaged because the nature of our native English was the luck of the draw. We just happened to be born or raised in a place where English was spoken. Leaders can be more inclusive of non-native speakers by fostering an open, supportive, and understanding environment. Be aware of cultural differences and respect them, fostering mutual understanding and appreciation among team members, and encourage openness by promoting an environment where everyone feels comfortable sharing their thoughts without fear of ridicule. Use clear and simple language, avoid jargon, idioms, and slang that might be confusing. Repeat important points and paraphrase them to ensure understanding, and you can use diagrams, charts, and other visual aids to clarify points. Speak slowly and clearly, giving non-native speakers time to process the information. Actively seek input from non-native speakers and validate their contributions, and recognize and reward the efforts of non-native speakers. Frequently check for understanding and ask if anyone has questions or need clarification. You can even pair non-native speakers with colleagues who can help them navigate the workplace and provide support and encourage learning about different cultures and perspectives by organizing cultural exchange sessions to help team members learn about each other's backgrounds and experiences. Team building activities that are inclusive and considerate of different cultural norms and preferences can be fun and engaging ways of broadening perspectives. And finally, you can provide accessible materials and resources like opportunities for language training or providing translation, transcription, or captioning tools and services. Most importantly, ensure that non-native speakers have the same opportunities for career development and advancement as others do. All right, effective teams develop strong commitment to a common approach or a process that defines how they will work together to accomplish their purpose. Some of these include task and project assignment processes to determine which team member will be assigned what work, how continuing membership in the team is earned, and how the group will make and modify decisions. And effective teams also need organizational processes to support them. Generally, these can be broken down into executive support, human resource practices, strength of team leadership, and the structure of the team itself. So let's dive into these aspects in more depth. Reaching decisions is an imperfect science. When cross-functional teams have trouble making decisions, leaders tend to blame psychological factors like mistrust or poor communication. But it's often the process that's the problem. W. Edwards Deming, the American professor and management consultant, said one of my favorite quotes. I say this all the time. I actually said it in one of the job interviews for the job I currently have when I was asked a question. And the quote is, "A bad system will beat a good person every time." A bad system will beat a good person every time. Later in this series, I'm going to discuss 4 strategies for overcoming blockers, one of which is managerial intervention. When teams come to a roadblock making a decision, the leader will often step in and make the final call. But this is counterproductive in many ways, which I'll discuss later. So it's actually preferable for a team to have strong decision-making processes to avoid managerial intervention. Bob Frisch, the author of Who's in the Room? How Great Leaders Structure and Manage the Teams Around Them, suggests 4 methods to include in a decision-making process to help teams break impasses. But before we get to these, let's discuss the voting paradox, first noted in the 18th century by French mathematician the Marquis de Condorcet. For my French colleagues, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So the voting paradox arises because different subsets of a team can generate conflicting majorities for all possible alternatives. Frisch gives the following example. Suppose a 9-person leadership team wants to cut costs and is weighing 3 options: closing plants, moving from direct sales to distributors, and reducing the benefits and pay of employees. Now, while any individual leader can rank order their own preferences, it's possible for a majority to be found simultaneously for each alternative. So 5 members might prefer A, closing plants, to B, using distributors, and a different set of 5 might prefer B, using distributors, to C, reducing benefits. Now, by the transitive property, A, closing plants, should be preferred to C, reducing benefits. But the paradox is that 5 members could rank C, reducing benefits, over A, closing plants. So instead of being transitive, the preferences are circular. Thus, no matter which option is selected, it's likely that different majorities will prefer alternative outcomes, and no voting method, like rank ordering, a point system, or so on, can solve the problem. What we want to avoid is what Frisch calls dictator by default syndrome, otherwise known as managerial intervention, where a manager steps in and makes the final call. For many reasons, the team should be working through a process to make a decision. but it's the leader's job to institute the process and guide the team through it when necessary. So let's dive into the strategies that Frisch includes in the decision-making process, starting with specifying a desired outcome. Without a clear outcome, team members choose options based on unspoken differing assumptions, so it's important to articulate specifically what you want the team to accomplish. One of the best ways to articulate clear outcomes is with a goal-setting methodology. I'm partial to OKRs, which are objectives and key results, but there are others like MBOs, which is management by objectives, balanced scorecards, or V2MOM, vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures. What's crucial in any of these methodologies is to keep discussions of the desired outcome distinct from discussions about how to achieve it. So again, what's crucial in any of these methodologies is to keep discussions of the desired outcome distinct from discussions about how to achieve that outcome. Now, it's also crucial to differentiate between an outcome and a task or a process. Now, that conversation is beyond the scope of this series, but in short, an outcome is any goal that has the ultimate final product as the target. For example, reorganize the bookshelf. A task or process is any action that leads to the outcome if that task or process is achieved, like decide to sort alphabetically or by genre. Now, additional resources on all of these topics are available on my website, jeffstrauss.net. So, first, provide a range of options. Accept, reject, or defer is a common decision-making practice, but to break impasses, it could be helpful to provide a more nuanced range of options. It's also very common for teams to think about what can't be done when options are presented. This is very, very common. People tend to think about what won't work first. Now, Frisch suggests asking a team whether a particular option is a wall, which can't be moved, or a fence, which can. Sometimes, simply asking these types of metaphors broadens perspectives and creates new possibilities. A former manager of mine once asked me if something was a shield or a sword. In other words, was the option I selected something that would provide resilience and stability, but not necessarily new capabilities, or would it provide us capabilities to forge ahead and break through barriers? Another strategy to include in a decision-making process is to surface preferences early by surveying team members prior to meetings to identify their preferences for particular options, identify areas of agreement and disagreement, and identify the potential for deadlock, setting the stage for much more productive conversations. This information can be gathered formally or informally through an ad hoc discussion or even through a survey sent to the team seeking feedback. And finally, to help break impasses, you can assign a devil's advocate to make thorough and dispassionate counterarguments an expected part of strategic deliberations. Now, often an advocate for a particular option is already sold on the idea, and any attack on the option is sometimes, and actually it's oftentimes, perceived as an attack on the person who is presenting it. Another way that I've heard this described that I like to say is an individual's ideas become their identities. And when their ideas are challenged, it becomes a challenge to their identity. But creating a devil's advocate to critique options depersonalizes the critiques and can help generate new ideas and angles on existing ideas that didn't exist before. So when researchers looked at high-performing, complex collaborative teams, they found that in every single case of the 55 teams across a broad range of organizations they researched, the company's top executives had invested significantly in building and maintaining social relationships throughout the organization. The best performing teams were parts of companies where executives created what researchers call signature practices, which are practices that are memorable, difficult to replicate outside of the organization, and are particularly well suited to their own business environment. Researchers looked at the British multinational oil and company BP's signature practices, which included building social networks by moving employees across functions, businesses, and countries as part of their career development. Now, BP trains employees that they move across functions to take on their new role, and besides becoming skilled in their job, BP found that this practice forces employees to become very good at meeting new people and building relationships with them. Modeling collaborative behavior is an important but often invisible practice from the executive level. The challenge is to overcome the challenge of visibility and show collaboration. At the British Bank Standard Chartered, researchers found that executives are exceptionally good role models when it comes to cooperation. They travel extensively, they often make trips for relatively brief meetings to invest in face-to-face interactions and create opportunities for people in the company to see top executives in action. In a remote or hybrid environment, especially at larger companies, most people see top executives relatively rarely at company all-hands meetings, for example. When I worked at the company formerly known as Twitter in the early 2010s, I used to work out in the company gym every day, and I used to see the former CEO, Dick Costolo, on a regular basis. In fact, at the company's Christmas party that year, Dick paid me personalized compliments based on what he knew of me outside the office, which was not only impressive to me, but to my date and those in the small huddle around him. This type of interaction is priceless. So priceless, I will never forget that interaction. And while I didn't consider it at the time, on reflection, the interaction had a significant impact on me. I became much more comfortable speaking with executives and in turn became much more confident speaking with others throughout the organization because of how our CEO showed a real connection with me, despite it being kind of a brief conversation. Now, feedback is another process that trickles down from the top. Though feedback is everyone's responsibility, leaders are prime movers in creating a feedback culture in an organization. I won't go into detail here, but my video on giving effective feedback, which is available on my website, jeffstrauss.net, goes into extensive detail on this topic, and I include a reference guide with key points and takeaways for giving effective feedback. Now, researchers looked at the impact of an array of HR practices, including selection, performance management, promotion, rewards, training, and formally sponsored coaching and mentoring programs. 2 HR practices improved team performance: training in skills related to collaborative behavior and support for support for informal community building. Researchers found that some teams had a collaborative culture but were not skilled in the practice of collaboration itself. A number of skills are crucial: appreciating others, being able to engage in purposeful conversation, productively and creatively resolving conflicts, and a quote hard skill, program management. Many HR organizations today encourage a sense of community through the practice of ERGs, or employee resource groups, which are voluntary employee-led initiatives that strengthen workplace relationships, foster a sense of belonging, promote personal and professional growth, and nurture the company community. Virtual events like games or other activities play a crucial role in cultivating a sense of community. Often, these events are scheduled, but spontaneous pop-up events can create an additional sense of fun and community. Training in these areas are shown to have a significant and measurable impact in team performance. When researchers looked at teams with high level of collaborative behaviors, they discovered that the team leaders made a significant difference. So they set out to discover how they achieved these results. And they discovered that the sweet spot for team leadership lay in between task and relationship orientation. The most productive, innovative teams were led by people who were both task and relationship oriented, and these leaders are able to adjust to their style as necessary. Now, at the early stages in the team life cycle that we discussed in the first part of this series, the most successful leaders were task-oriented. They created a clear mission, vision, and goals. They set expectations and commitments. They clarified responsibilities of individual team members. And recall that two factors for team success are they have a compelling direction and expert coaching. Right? So successful team leaders are able to set the team's North Star and coach the team toward it, which, as we know based on our knowledge of the team life cycle, is particularly important in the early stages of team development. Project managers are skilled at task management, and it would benefit team leaders without a background in project or program management to learn some of those skills that that profession uses to unlock their own potential. Now, at a certain point in the team life cycle, successful team leaders switched to relationship orientation, which often happens once team members internalize teams and individual goals and accountabilities, and when initial tensions around knowledge sharing begin to emerge. Now, producing ambidextrous team leaders, those with the ability to shift between task and relationship orientation when needed, should be a core goal of any leadership development program. Performance review processes should emphasize growth in both kinds of skills. For example, by asking leaders to provide examples of when they've used relationship building to get things done. Now, finally, let's discuss team structure. Newly formed teams, particularly those with a high proportion of members who are strangers at the time of formation, find it more difficult to collaborate than those with established relationships. Recall the example at the beginning of this part of the series where we spoke about fatigued pilots that knew each other performing better than fresh pilots who didn't know each other. Research has indicated that when 20 to 40% of team members on a new team are already well connected to one another, the team has strong collaboration from the get-go. You may not hit that percentage every time, but the point is, on a new team, try to leverage existing relationships as often as possible. Often, you'll need to build a team from scratch, and it can be a good opportunity to create high-quality relationships. Take a look at my video on high quality relationships, available on my website, jeffstrauss.net, in the bootcamp section. In that video, I discuss the key factors of a high quality relationship and how to develop it, which can be used to help develop the relationships on your team. It also helps if the company leadership has taken other measures to cultivate networks that cross boundaries, as we just discussed with leadership and HR processes. Now, finally, as we've discussed, it's crucial that individuals on teams have clearly defined roles. Research indicates that collaboration improves as role ambiguity decreases. So collaboration improves as the ambiguity of roles decreases. Without role clarity, team members tend to waste energy negotiating roles and protecting their turf. Particularly skilled in this area are my friends, software engineers. Researchers found that individuals on engineering teams, despite geographical location and different first languages, are given autonomy over one discrete piece of a project, which encouraged members to work independently to accomplish their specific task. But every team member understood and worked toward the overall team goal. Wow. Thank you so much for watching this part 2 series on teams. If you found any of this information helpful or informative, please like and subscribe to my channel to get notified of all my content. I post training like this and other content regularly. You can also subscribe to my Substack at jeffstrauss.substack.com, where I release written content on management and leadership, all completely for free. All of these links and more content on leadership, like podcast interviews, link collections, and more, are available on my website, jeffstrauss.net. I really appreciate you sitting through this almost hour-long presentation on part 2 of my 3-part series on teams. This part 2 being why teams don't work and why teams work. I hope you found it helpful and informative, and if you did, again, please like and share on any of the platforms that you may find this. It's tremendously helpful to me. I hope you found this helpful once again. Thank you so much, and I hope you tune in for part 3, the final part of this series.